Backstory is specifically defined as a set of events preceding the main narrative, particularly having to do with the whys and hows of the world being presented to the audience and serving as an answer to the question, how did we get to here? Now, no matter what kind of story we're talking about, it's important to lend some thought to the decisions the author will make while crafting the world their story characters are going to inhabit, particularly when it comes to signature elements, that is, what makes each world unique. One of the things I stress over and over again when developing or reviewing stories is that everyone has a reason for doing what they do, whether it be on an individual level, as a country, or an organization as a whole. Regardless of their size, intention, or overall purpose in your story, any actions any party may take must be consistent with the background established both to the audience and any details that have yet to be revealed. Everything a person does or does not do can be traced back in some way to previous experience in their past, whether it be a lesson your parents taught you, a traumatic memory, or something else entirely. What's important is that the writer understand that whether you realize it or not, your past experience drives your future decisions, and this is just as true for the antagonists as well as the protagonists. One of the things I'd like to call to your attention is the fact that most stories aimed at younger audiences tend to provide a lot of the elements as a given. For example, the good guys usually tend to live in bright, colorful places where it's automatically assumed that everyone that lives there is a good person. The bad guys' lairs are usually dark, dismal locations filled with unpleasant surroundings such as lightning or dark clouds. Now, the reason for this is that we are, through the medium of the story, teaching our kids things about the world that surrounds them. When we reach a certain age, we start to notice that our stories become more complex, with less things assumed to be true at the outset. As our minds become more capable of internalizing complex concepts, we start to expect more of the stories we experience, and rightly so. Now, contrary to popular belief when I was growing up, just because a medium is aimed towards younger audiences does not mean they are incapable of understanding it. Some of my favorite cartoons are aimed towards younger audiences but still embody complex themes such as prejudice, racism, and death. Two of my favorite examples are Legend of Korra and the original X-Men animated series. Without getting too far into it, Korra deals with themes about mental illness, sexuality, terrorism, and so on, while the X-Men teaches people about bigotry and equality, with both addressing the subjects realistically and with respect. In both cases, I've always felt that their willingness to tackle more complex story mechanics not only makes them better narratives, but makes them universally accessible to all ages. Plus, at their core, they are just good stories. Now back to the subject at hand. When writing fiction, it's essential to remember the importance of backstory and the fact that the more mature the audience, the less that can be considered as a given. When writing fiction for any audience older than preteen, then I would say it's the responsibility of the author to accept accountability for every aspect of their story. Now, of course, when I say this, I primarily refer to professional endeavors, meaning any scenario in which a writer is offering their work for sale. But even in the event that the writer is writing purely for personal enjoyment, I encourage everyone to carefully consider the effect that backstory has on the narrative. Now, when telling a story, we as the audience give the author the benefit of the doubt. Under the assumption that everything they tell us is true and that we are being told what we need to know, we enter the story trusting the author to steer us around the curves. That being said, this is where backstory comes in. Think of backstory as the blueprints to a house. While it's likely you'll never see the plans that caused the house to take its future shape, without them, the house would not resemble the finished product. Now, I know that backstory may not be the foremost thing on an author's mind when writing the story, but here's why it's important. I'm going to sum it up for you in 2 words. Consistency matters. When planning a narrative, it's important to think about the key entities and why they do what they do. It's no longer acceptable to say because the author says so and hand-wave away the responsibility. Whatever goes into the story must be justified, either by previous events, facts established during the dialogue and exposition, or logical inference. In other words, if the characters don't think or say it, if the previous novel didn't explain it, or if it cannot logically be assumed to be true given facts and evidence, then we are left with a question which must be answered before the story can proceed. In particular, when establishing a story world, it's important to bear in mind that we assume certain things to be true. The laws of physics, that the characters will speak our native language, things like that. Now, when the story is based on the modern world, we can accept that most of these things don't require explanation, but when the author starts inserting elements that deviate from the world we know, it cannot be assumed that your audience understands where you're going with aspects of the story world they're not familiar with. To offer an example, let's suppose you're introducing magic. This presents several questions to the reader, and while these questions do not need to be answered right away, the benefit of the doubt only extends so far, and usually by the time the story gets going, these things need to be addressed. The first questions with regards to magic are things like, what are its limitations? What can and can it do? What is its source? Who has it? Do they run out of power? Who's responsible for regulating it? How do you learn it? How much of the population has access to it? Is it only for the elites? How about how long has it been around? Is it common or practiced in secret? And while some or all of these questions may come up in the story, the best ones are the ones that already have an answer to these questions, even if the audience never learns it directly. With the right narrative, these questions will be answered by the decisions the author makes. Hopefully during the planning stages, they'll develop the plot with questions like this in mind. As the story unfolds, the information is slowly passed on to the reader when it's important and helps the audience to comprehend the players involved. Let's look at another example. A frequent plot device in speculative fiction is genetically engineered life forms. Now, while everybody knows what they are, what is often a potential minefield are the caveats that come with it. When using genetically engineered life forms, I often find myself looking for certain things, like how many of them are there or how long have they been around. Frequently used for plots involving either human rights issues or racism, this especially brings to mind for what purpose were they originally invented. And unlike natural-born life forms, especially given a conventional economy, an explanation must be offered as to both who paid for it and why. Now, the reason why I say this is it's not enough to simply state they're genetically engineered. No one would create a race just for the fun of it. There is a purpose and a source of funding, whether it be for slave labor or disposable soldiers or something else entirely, but there must be a reason, and it has to make sense. There's a saying that the two things that are inevitable are death and taxes, and this is why that demands a response. If you're going to create a race of frogmen, then someone has to pay for it. Sorry, mad scientists, but even evil corporations got to pay the bills somehow. Joking aside, the reason matters because it also speaks to how they are perceived by society and what rights or privileges they may have access to. And while the natural tendency is to think of life forms as life, when you're dipping into genetic manipulation, we have ethics issues, whether it's right to make life or does someone own them. We have these same questions with artificial life, robots, or holograms. Now, on a singular basis, we can forgo some of the questions prominent with a larger population, like if they were given rights, how did they earn them, or what events came about during their evolutionary period. This question is important because historical precedent has proven that any time a new group seeks rights, they must first challenge those in power to receive it. Study your history and consider that it took women almost 100 years to be allowed to vote, and people of color are still struggling to this day. The simple fact is that when dealing with introducing a new race, genetically engineered or not, the narrative must take into account the people already living in that society and what their reaction will be. On a character level, it's not necessary to know every character's backstory, but I would encourage authors to at least think about developing some history for the main characters and entities, as even if we do not learn this information through the story, any personal history they may have will influence their behavior. For example, if a character is reticent to share personal details, maybe there's a reason as to why. If someone is always bubbly, perhaps they're hiding a trauma behind a facade of happiness. Whatever the story is about, doing this beforehand will enable the author to characterize their behavior accordingly, and strengthen both the narrative and their relationships. This way, when the audience discovers the reason for this behavior, it is consistent with what has already been established so far and helps avoid conflicting information. Now, whether the backstory is ever shared with the audience is largely up to the author, but regardless of whether or not it matters to the story being told, it is an important element not to be overlooked.
Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. You can also find me on Twitter and a few other places on the web, or support me via Patreon or Ko-fi. Zebra hugs!